Ferrari's technical directors have confirmed, through documents filed with the FIA ahead of the Hungarian Grand Prix, that a revised rear wing assembly has passed all required load and flex tests. That much is not speculation. That much is on the record, stamped, dated, and sitting in a regulatory file that will outlive every rumor swirling around it. But here is the question nobody in Maranello wants to answer directly. Is this the wing that finally closes a 7/10 of a second gap? 7/10. A number that sounds small until you say it out loud in front of a driver who has spent a season watching taillights disappear into turn 1. 7/10 per lap. Every lap. For 14 races. Picture a sprinter who loses a 100-meter race by the length of a bus every single time for 14 races in a row, and then imagine being told that the fix might already exist, sitting in a crate, waiting for a single practice session to prove it. That is what 7/10 feels like when you are strapped into a car doing 200 miles an hour down the Hungaroring's backstraight, watching a Red Bull or a McLaren simply walk away like the corner ahead belongs to someone else. The stakes right now are not abstract. Ferrari sits third in the constructors' standings, 44 points off second, with 9 races remaining this season. Their last win came in April. Their last pole position came even earlier than that. Hungaroring, a track that punishes anyone without mechanical grip and rear stability, has not been kind to Ferrari since 2019, and every year since has added another layer of frustration onto a fan base that remembers what winning used to feel like. The team's best finish there, across the last 3 seasons, is a distant 4th, and in 2 of those 3 years, the car in question qualified outside the top 8 before clawing back positions through strategy rather than raw pace, a pattern that tells its own story about where the weakness truly lives. Some longtime observers of the team have gone further, according to Italian outlets that cover Maranello closely, suggesting this is the quietest a Ferrari garage has been heading into a home-adjacent European weekend in nearly a decade. Quiet, in Formula One, rarely means calm. It usually means something is being held together with tape and hope, and everyone inside the building knows it, even if nobody outside is allowed to say it. So why has it gotten this bad? 3 reasons, according to multiple paddock sources, and each one is worse than the last. The first is aerodynamic. Ferrari's current rear wing, according to insiders close to the technical department, has been bleeding downforce through high-speed corners in a way the simulation models did not predict. Wind tunnel data promised one behavior. The track delivered another. That is a design problem. Frustrating, expensive, but on paper at least, fixable with enough hours and enough carbon fiber. The second is more troubling. Some estimates suggest the car's rear end has become unpredictable exactly when drivers need confidence the most. In the entry phase of medium-speed corners, the exact moment where a driver has to commit fully or not at all. That is not a design problem anymore. That is a trust problem. And trust, once it cracks inside a cockpit, is much harder to rebuild than a wing. But the third reason is the one nobody wants to say plainly in a press conference. Paddock chatter indicates that the unpredictability has started to bleed into the drivers themselves, that hesitation has crept into inputs that used to be automatic, muscle memory built over years, suddenly second-guessing itself in real time. A car that a driver cannot trust with his hands stops being just a technical liability. It becomes a physical one, and drivers do not walk away from crashes the way engineers walk away from bad data on a laptop screen. That is the wall Ferrari has been driving into for months. But it is also, according to sources inside the factory, exactly what led to this moment. Because desperation has a way of forcing engineers to look in places pride usually keeps them from looking. The new rear wing was not born from a clean sheet. It was born from desperation and, oddly enough, from an old idea buried in a rival's history. Multiple technical sources have pointed to a wing philosophy Lewis Hamilton championed years ago at Mercedes, a design built around aggressive flex underload, one that opens the wing fractionally at high speed to cut drag. then snaps rigid under braking to restore downforce exactly when it is needed. It is being called, informally in the paddock, a Hamilton-inspired twist, though Ferrari has not used that phrase publicly, and no official statement has attached his name to the concept in any capacity. That framing did not come from Maranello. It came from engineers who worked adjacent to that era and now recognize the fingerprints on a design they once studied from the outside. Back when studying it felt like studying an enemy's playbook, rather than a blueprint worth borrowing. Is that irony intentional? Almost certainly not. But it is hard to ignore that the team trying to close the gap to Hamilton's former employer may be borrowing, even indirectly, from Hamilton's own legacy, a detail that has not gone unnoticed among engineers who remember exactly where that philosophy first appeared on a grid, and who now find themselves reverse engineering something they once dismissed as marginal. There is history here worth remembering. Ferrari has attempted flexing rear-wing concepts before, according to technical journalists who track FIA filings closely, and at least one earlier version was quietly withdrawn 2 seasons ago after early data suggested it created more inconsistency than benefit. That attempt never raced. It disappeared from technical bulletins without explanation, the way failed ideas often do in a sport that punishes public admission of failure. So the question this time is not just whether the concept works, it is whether Ferrari has actually solved the problem that killed it the last time, or whether they are simply better at hiding the same risk under a new name. That question matters more than it sounds, because a team's memory of its own failures is often shorter than its ambition. Engineers who worked on the earlier version are said to have raised concerns internally before this project was greenlit, according to a source, with knowledge of the technical department's structure, though those concerns were reportedly overruled at a leadership level under pressure to produce something, anything, before the season slipped further away. That is not a detail Ferrari would confirm on record, but it is a detail that explains why some inside the building are cautiously excited, while others are quietly bracing for a repeat. Here is what the wing is actually said to do, according to documents reviewed by several outlets covering the FIA's technical filings. The main plane uses a revised carbon layup that allows a small, legal degree of twist under aerodynamic load. At speeds above roughly 250 km per hour, the trailing edge opens by a few millimeters, reducing drag on the straights. Under braking, when load reverses, the wing snaps back to its rigid, high downforce state almost instantly. In plain terms, it behaves like a wing with 2 personalities, one built for speed, one built for grip. Switching between them without a single moving part, a rulebook could flag as illegal, and without a driver ever touching a button. That is the theory. But theory and a Friday practice session are 2 very different things, and Ferrari has learned that lesson before, more than once, in front of a global audience. Break the 7/10ths down, and it stops looking like one clean number, and starts looking like 3 fragile assumptions stacked on top of each other, each one carrying its own risk. Roughly 3/10ths is expected to come from reduced straight-line drag, a number engineers feel relatively confident about because it is grounded in wind tunnel physics that rarely lie. Another 2/10ths, according to internal estimates, is expected from restored high-speed cornering stability, a number built on simulation data that has already burned this team once this season. The final 2/10ths is the most fragile of all, attributed to driver confidence returning once the car stops snapping unpredictably mid-corner. And confidence is not something you can bolt onto a chassis overnight. That last 2/10ths cannot be measured on a dyno. It can only be measured in a driver's hands, under pressure, in real time, lap after lap, corner after corner, with nowhere to hide if it fails. And that is exactly where insiders have started to introduce doubt. One source with knowledge of the car's development has suggested the flex tolerances required to make this work reliably are tighter than anything Ferrari has attempted before, and that even a small manufacturing inconsistency between the 2 race cars could mean one driver gets the full benefit while the other gets almost none. Another engineer, speaking on condition of anonymity, questioned whether the wing's twist behavior will remain consistent as track temperature rises through a Hungaroring weekend, when asphalt temperatures can climb past 50 degrees Celsius under a summer sun that shows no mercy. A part that behaves perfectly at 10 in the morning does not always behave the same way at 3 in the afternoon. And Hungaroring is notorious for exactly that kind of temperature swing, catching teams off guard. Rival teams are said to be watching closely, according to sources who cover technical protests within the paddock. At least one competitor has reportedly requested clarification from the FIA on the flex tolerances involved, a move that in itself does not prove wrongdoing, but historically has preceded closer post-session scrutiny of a part once it actually turns a lap in anger. If the wing performs as hoped, it will not just face the judgment of a stopwatch, it will face the judgment of a technical delegate with a measuring rig, and those two judges do not always agree. There is also the matter of timing, which paddock veterans say should not be underestimated. Introducing a part this ambitious at Hungaroring, rather than waiting for a lower downforce track where risk is easier to manage, is itself a signal. According to sources familiar with the team's internal planning, the decision to debut now rather than later was driven by the calendar itself, 9 races remaining and shrinking, rather than by any sense that conditions here were ideal for a first appearance. In other words, this was not the wing arriving when Ferrari wanted it to arrive. It was the wing arriving when Ferrari could no longer afford to wait. The team principal, for his part, has stayed carefully neutral in public, according to transcripts of his most recent media session. He described the update as, in his words relayed through translation, a step the team believes in, without committing to any specific number or timeline for results. That kind of language is not accidental. In Formula One, a team boss who avoids numbers entirely is usually a team boss who knows exactly how painful the wrong number would be if it failed to arrive on Sunday. Meanwhile, the second driver's camp has stayed almost silent, according to 2 people familiar with the team's internal communications this week. A silence some observers have read as caution rather than confidence. Silence, in a paddock built on carefully managed messaging, is rarely neutral. It is usually a decision, and decisions like that tend to mean someone inside the building is waiting to see data before saying anything they might later have to walk back in front of cameras. So which is it? A breakthrough, or a beautifully engineered risk that only works in a wind tunnel and on a printed spec sheet? Whatever the answer, the people who have to find out are not spreadsheets. They are 2 drivers who have spent months absorbing the consequences of a car that hesitates when it should commit. Trust, in a Formula One cockpit, is not a marketing word. It is the difference between committing to a corner at the absolute limit and lifting 0.5% earlier out of instinct, and that 0.5% is often the entire race, the entire weekend, sometimes the entire narrative of a season. One driver, according to someone close to the team, has already said privately that he will know within the first 3 corners of Friday practice whether the car feels like an ally again or still feels like something to manage rather than trust. That is not a technical statement. That is a human one, and it is the kind of statement that either gets forgotten by Sunday evening or gets replayed on broadcast for years, depending entirely on which way those first 3 corners go. Because if this wing works, it does not just close 0.7 of a lap time. It potentially rewrites the psychological arc of Ferrari's entire season, turning a team that has spent months explaining away disappointment into one that walks into Hungaroring with something it has not had in a long time, which is belief, the kind of belief that shows up in body language before it ever shows up on a timing screen. But if it does not work, if the twist behaves inconsistently, if track temperature exposes a flaw the simulations missed, if one car gets the benefit and the other does not, then Ferrari does not just lose a race weekend. It loses momentum heading into the second half of a season it cannot afford to lose again, and it hands the paddock one more reason to write off a comeback story before it even properly begins. So which version of this story is Hungaroring going to tell? The version where a wing borrowed, even unofficially, from an old rival's playbook becomes the turning point of Ferrari's year, the moment engineers point back to in documentaries years from now. Or the version where 7/10 on paper quietly becomes 2/10 on track, and the paddock moves on to the next theory by Monday morning, as if this one never happened at all. Nobody outside that garage knows yet. Not the engineers who built it, not the drivers who will feel it first, and certainly not anyone watching from the grandstands or their living room, phone in hand, refreshing timing data before the session has even finished. If it works, this is the weekend people point back to as the moment things changed, the exact session where a season quietly turned. If it does not, it becomes one more line in a season already full of almosts, another footnote in a story that keeps promising a turn it has not yet delivered, and another Sunday where 7/10 stayed exactly where it has always been, just out of reach. What do you think happens when lights go out at the Hungaroring? Drop your prediction in the comments, and if you want to see whether this theory holds up once practice data comes in, make sure you are subscribed, because this story is not finished yet.